My father convinced my boyfriend to marry my cousin. He told him, "She's stronger and better for you." I was heartbroken when I found out, but I decided to rebuild my life. Years later, we reunited at a grand party thrown by me, and when they saw my husband, their faces turned pale. I 29F. Never thought my own father would orchestrate the destruction of my happiness, but life has a way of teaching you that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. It started 5 years ago when I was head over heels in love with someone I thought would be my forever. We'd been together for 2 years, planning our future, talking about marriage and kids. I was working as a junior marketing coordinator then, barely making ends meet but optimistic about climbing the corporate ladder. My boyfriend seemed supportive, always encouraging me to chase my dreams. My cousin had just moved back to town after finishing her MBA from a prestigious university. She was everything I wasn't: confident, polished, from a wealthy family, and according to everyone, more practical about life. Where I was a dreamer, she was calculated. Where I struggled financially, she had trust funds and connections. The first red flag should have been when my father started inviting my boyfriend over for family dinners more frequently. He'd always been distant with my relationships before, barely acknowledging the guys I dated. But suddenly, he was taking an active interest, asking about his career prospects, his family background, his 5-year plan. I remember feeling happy that my father was finally warming up to someone I loved. How naive I was. The conversations between my father and boyfriend became longer, more private. They'd disappear into my father's study after dinner, talking for hours about business, investments, and what my father called building a stable future. I thought it was sweet that they were bonding. Then my cousin started joining these family dinners. At first, it seemed innocent. She was new in town, needed to reconnect with family. But I noticed how my father would steer conversations toward her achievements, her connections, her practical approach to life. He'd mention how she'd already secured a high-paying job at a multinational company, how her family had real estate investments, how she understood the importance of strategic partnerships in marriage. My boyfriend started becoming distant around the same time. Our conversations became shorter, less intimate. When I'd bring up our future plans, he'd deflect or say we needed to be more realistic about our expectations. The word realistic started appearing in his vocabulary more often, always in the context of what my father had been saying. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd planned a surprise dinner for our 2-year anniversary, spent my entire week's grocery budget on ingredients for his favorite meal. I was waiting at my apartment when he called to cancel, saying he needed to have an important conversation with my father about our situation. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I drove to my parents' house and saw his car in the driveway alongside my cousin's. Through the living room window, I could see the three of them sitting around the coffee table, papers spread between them like they were negotiating a business deal. I used my key to enter quietly, staying in the hallway where I could hear everything. My father was explaining how my cousin would be a better investment for my boyfriend's future. She had connections that could help his struggling consulting business, family money that could provide stability, and what he called the right mindset for building wealth. My father told him I was too much of a dreamer, too focused on creative pursuits that wouldn't lead to financial security. He said my cousin was stronger, more ambitious, better suited for the kind of partnership that would actually succeed in the long term. The worst part was hearing my boyfriend agree. He said he'd been thinking the same thing, that he needed someone who could match his ambition, someone who understood that love wasn't enough if you couldn't build a stable life together. My cousin chimed in, talking about how she'd always found him interesting and how they seemed more compatible in terms of life goals. They were planning their engagement while I stood in the hallway, listening to my entire world crumble. I left without confronting them. What was the point? The three people I trusted most had already decided my fate without including me in the conversation. The official breakup happened 2 days later. My boyfriend fed me the usual lines about growing apart, wanting different things, needing to focus on his career. He never mentioned my cousin or my father's involvement. I played along, pretending I didn't know the truth, because I was too devastated to fight. They announced their engagement 6 weeks later. My family acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I should be happy for them. My mother kept saying how perfect they were together, how my cousin would be such a good influence on him. My father acted like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just destroyed his own daughter's happiness for what he considered a better family alliance. I moved across the country 3 months later. I told everyone it was for a better job opportunity, but really, I just needed to escape the suffocating environment where everyone expected me to smile and pretend I was fine with being betrayed by the people who were supposed to love me most. The first year was brutal. I was broke, lonely, and struggling to rebuild my confidence in a new city where I knew nobody. I worked 2 jobs while taking night classes to improve my marketing skills. Some days I barely had enough money for groceries, but I was determined to prove everyone wrong about my potential. Slowly, things started improving. I landed a better position at a growing startup, where my creative ideas were actually valued. I threw myself into work, learning everything I could about digital marketing, brand strategy, and business development. I made new friends who saw me for who I was, not as the impractical dreamer my father had labeled me. 2 years after moving, I met someone at a professional networking event. He was different from anyone I'd dated before, successful but humble, ambitious but kind. He owned a chain of boutique hotels and was looking for someone to revamp his marketing strategy. What started as a professional relationship slowly developed into something deeper. He never made me feel like I had to choose between love and ambition. Instead, he encouraged both, helping me see that I could build the creative career I wanted while also achieving financial success. When I told him about my past, about how my family had convinced my ex that I wasn't good enough, he was furious on my behalf but also determined to show me what real partnership looked like. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony with just our closest friends. By then, I'd started my own marketing consultancy and was working with high-profile clients. My husband's business was expanding internationally, and we were building something beautiful together, both personally and professionally. I hadn't spoken to my family since leaving town. They'd tried reaching out a few times, especially my mother, but I wasn't ready to forgive or forget. I needed to focus on building my new life without the toxicity of people who'd proven they didn't have my best interests at heart. My business really took off in year 4. I'd landed several major accounts and was being featured in industry publications as a rising star in digital marketing. My husband and I had just closed on a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood, and we were planning to expand his hotel chain to the East Coast. That's when I decided it was time to face my past. I started planning what I called my homecoming party, ostensibly a celebration of my business success, but really an opportunity to show everyone exactly what they'd dismissed 5 years earlier. I rented the ballroom at the most exclusive hotel in my hometown, hired the best caterers, and sent elegant invitations to everyone from my old life. The invitation was carefully worded to sound like a professional networking event with personal celebration mixed in. I mentioned my successful marketing consultancy, my husband's hotel empire, and our recent achievements. I made sure to include enough details to make it clear that the impractical dreamer had built something impressive. I knew my family would come. My father never could resist an opportunity to network with successful business people, and my mother would be curious about how I'd turned out. I also knew my cousin and ex would be there. They were still married, still living in the same social circles, and my cousin's competitive nature would never let her miss an opportunity to see how she measured up against me. The weeks leading up to the party were intense. I worked with event planners to ensure every detail was perfect. The venue, the food, the entertainment, everything had to communicate success and sophistication. My husband was incredibly supportive, understanding that this wasn't just about showing off but about reclaiming my narrative and confronting the people who'd tried to write me off. The night of the party arrived, and I felt a mixture of nerves and excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I wore a stunning designer dress that my husband had surprised me with, and I felt more confident than I ever had in my 20s. This wasn't about revenge in a petty sense. It was about showing up as the person I'd become despite their attempts to diminish me. The ballroom looked incredible. Soft lighting, elegant floral arrangements, a jazz quartet playing in the corner. The guest list was a mix of my new professional contacts, friends from my current life, and the people from my past who doubted me. I positioned myself near the entrance to greet everyone personally. My parents arrived first, looking uncomfortable but trying to hide it behind polite smiles. My mother hugged me tentatively, commenting on how successful I looked. My father shook my hand formally, his eyes already scanning the room to assess the other guests and their potential value to him. I introduced them to some of my business associates, watching my father's expression change as he realized the caliber of people I was now connected with. These weren't just successful professionals, they were the kind of high-level contacts he'd always wished he had access to. Then my cousin and ex-boyfriend arrived, and I felt my heart rate spike despite all my preparation. They looked older, more settled, but there was something in their expressions that suggested things hadn't gone exactly as planned. My cousin's designer outfit was trying a bit too hard, and my ex had the slightly desperate look of someone whose business ventures hadn't quite taken off the way he'd hoped. I greeted them warmly, playing the gracious hostess. My cousin complimented the venue and asked about my business, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes calculating. My ex was more awkward, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but trying to make polite conversation about my success. I spent the first hour of the party mingling, making sure to introduce my family and old acquaintances to my new contacts. I watched my father's growing realization that I'd built exactly the kind of network he'd always envied. My cousin kept asking subtle questions about my business revenue and client base, trying to figure out exactly how successful I'd become. Then my husband arrived. I'd asked him to come a bit later so I could handle the initial introductions myself, but his entrance was worth the wait. He walked into the ballroom like he owned it, which in a sense he did. His hotel chain was well known in luxury travel circles, and several people in the room recognized him immediately. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built an empire without needing to prove anything to anyone. When he spotted me across the room, his face lit up with genuine affection, and he made his way over to where I was standing with my family. I watched my father's face change as I introduced my husband. The recognition was immediate. He'd obviously heard of the hotel chain, probably stayed at one of the properties. My cousin's expression shifted from polite interest to something closer to shock as my husband mentioned their recent expansion and the new properties they were developing. But it was my ex-boyfriend's reaction that was most telling. His face went completely pale as my husband casually mentioned a business deal he'd just closed, the kind of opportunity my ex had always dreamed about but never been able to access. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. By choosing my cousin for her connections and practical mindset, he'd actually missed out on the kind of partnership that could have transformed his career. My husband was gracious and charming, asking thoughtful questions about their lives and careers without any hint of condescension. But his mere presence was a statement that spoke louder than any words could have. This was what real success looked like, not just money, but confidence, genuine achievement, and the kind of partnership that elevated both people involved. As the evening progressed, I could see the wheels turning in everyone's minds. My father kept trying to engage my husband in business conversations, clearly hoping to establish some kind of connection or opportunity. My cousin was asking increasingly direct questions about our lifestyle, our travels, our future plans. My ex-boyfriend was mostly quiet, looking like he was reassessing every decision he'd made in the past 5 years. The most satisfying moment came when my husband was telling a story about how we'd met and how my marketing expertise had helped transform his business. He spoke about me with such genuine respect and admiration, describing me as his partner in every sense of the word. He mentioned specific campaigns I'd developed, deals I'd negotiated, and how my creative approach had opened doors he'd never considered. I could see my family processing this information, realizing that the impractical dreamer they'd dismissed had actually become exactly the kind of strategic partner they'd claimed I could never be. The difference was that I'd found someone who recognized my value instead of trying to diminish it. Near the end of the evening, my father approached me privately. He started to say something about being proud of what I'd accomplished, but I could see in his eyes that he was really calculating what my success might mean for him. He asked if there might be opportunities for collaboration between my business and his investments. I smiled politely and told him I'd consider it, but we both knew I wouldn't. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with a simple business proposition. My cousin cornered me by the bar later, trying to play catch-up like old friends. She mentioned how happy she was to see me doing so well, how she'd always known I had potential. The revisionist history was almost amusing. She was trying to rewrite our past to make herself look supportive instead of opportunistic. I let her talk, responding with the kind of polite but distant friendliness you'd show to any acquaintance. There was no point in rehashing old grievances or calling out her selective memory. My success spoke for itself. My ex-boyfriend didn't approach me directly, but I caught him watching me throughout the evening. There was something in his expression that looked like regret, maybe even recognition of what he'd given up. But it was too late for that kind of reflection to matter. As the party wound down and guests started leaving, my husband and I stood together accepting congratulations and saying goodbye. My family lingered, clearly hoping for more private conversation, but I kept things brief and cordial. I thanked them for coming and suggested we stay in touch, knowing that any future relationship would be on my terms. After everyone left, my husband and I sat in the empty ballroom, sharing a quiet drink and reflecting on the evening. He asked if I felt like I'd gotten the closure I was looking for, and I realized that I had. Not because I'd proven anything to them, but because I'd proven something to myself. The girl who'd been dismissed as an impractical dreamer had built a life that exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. I'd found love that elevated rather than diminished me, success that came from my own efforts rather than family connections, and confidence that no one could take away. Update 1. 3 weeks after the party, my mother called. She'd been thinking about our conversation that night and wanted to have a more honest discussion about what had happened 5 years ago. She admitted that she'd known about my father's involvement in breaking up my relationship but had felt powerless to stop it. She explained that my father had genuinely believed he was protecting me from what he saw as a mistake. In his mind, my ex-boyfriend wasn't ambitious enough to provide the security he wanted for his daughter, and my cousin's family connections made her a better match. He'd convinced himself that he was saving me from future disappointment. My mother's call was the first real acknowledgement I'd received that what happened to me was wrong. She didn't make excuses for my father's behavior, but she helped me understand his twisted logic. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it provided some context for his actions. She also mentioned that my cousin's marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared. My ex-boyfriend's business had struggled despite the family connections, and there were rumors about financial problems and relationship issues. She wasn't telling me this to be gossipy, but to help me understand that the practical choice hadn't turned out to be so practical after all. Update 2. 6 months later, I received a LinkedIn message from my ex-boyfriend. He'd apparently been following my business success through mutual connections and wanted to congratulate me on a recent award I'd won for innovative marketing campaigns. The message was professional but personal, acknowledging that he'd made mistakes in the past and expressing genuine admiration for what I'd built. He didn't explicitly apologize for how things ended between us, but there was an undertone of regret in his words. I responded politely but briefly, thanking him for the congratulations and wishing him well in his endeavors. I didn't see any point in reopening old wounds or rehashing past decisions. We were both different people now, living different lives, and that was exactly as it should be. Update 3. A year after the party, my business had grown to the point where I was considering opening a second office. My husband and I were also expecting our first child, and we were both excited about this new chapter in our lives. I'd maintained minimal contact with my family, exchanging holiday cards and occasional updates but keeping our relationship surface level. My father had made a few more attempts to establish business connections, but I'd politely declined each time. The real victory wasn't in showing them what they'd missed, it was in building a life so fulfilling that their opinions no longer mattered. I'd found my own definition of success, one that included both professional achievement and personal happiness. Looking back, I'm almost grateful for what happened 5 years ago. If my father hadn't interfered, If my ex-boyfriend hadn't chosen my cousin, I might never have been forced to discover my own strength. I might have settled for a relationship where I had to prove my worth instead of finding one where my value was never questioned. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me ultimately led me to a life better than anything I could have imagined in my 20s. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. You just have to be willing to rebuild from the ashes and trust that you're capable of more than anyone else believes.